Well, after getting a little bit of recession 101, a term I think that we're going to have to get accustomed and comfortable with in the coming year, we like to begin our journey on this road to recovery with Dr. Justin Ram. Dr. Justin Ram is CEO of Justin Ram Advisory Associates and GSEC. He has over 25 years of practical advisory, research, and management experience. He has worked as an economist in over 32 countries across the Caribbean, Central Asia, Africa, and Europe. Justin has a diploma in executive management from Stanford University, a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he holds an MSc in economics from University College. He is also a graduate of the University of the West Indies and has a postgraduate certificate in sustainable environment management from the University of California, Berkeley. And I note that, recently the Prime Minister of Barbados, Prime Minister Motley, has recognized that advisors are key to economic recovery. So we very much look forward to Justin's sharing, because he has indeed been the economic advisor to several of our Caribbean nations, including Barbados, Grenada, Guyana, and around the world, Uganda, Zambia, amongst others. So Justin, we are very keen to hear from you as you speak to us about our own economic recovery and the prospects that exist.
Okay, thank you very much, Renata. I'm just wondering if you can all hear me fine. I've started to share my slides. Hello? Great. Great. So thank you very much. And I really want to say a special thank you to the Institute of Chartered Accountants of the Caribbean for inviting me to speak with you this morning. It's a great privilege to be here with you. And while I'll be doing this, let me just go to my content slide and what I'll be presenting to you this morning. I think it's really important for us to look at our immediate past performance here in the Caribbean. To also then look at our risk and challenges, just to give you a reminder of what those are. Look at what's our outlook for 2022 and beyond. And then, because I've been asked to speak about how we build resilience, I think I just want to share with you some new ideas about resilience building, which I think have become so much more important in my mind. And certainly since I have branched off on my own in the private sector. So let's look at the immediate past performance. Well, as you're aware, we do have these global risks. I think everybody is quite aware of these risks: declining asset prices, inflation, as you were just hearing in that video that was being played by the conference secretariat, and whether or not we're likely to have recession. Conflict, as we all know, what's happening over in Ukraine with Russia. Supply chain disruptions, of course, coming out primarily from the pandemic. Climate change is, of course, an ever-present danger to the globe, but even more so for us in the Caribbean. And of course, we're still in the midst of a pandemic, although we seem to be coming out of it. And of course, this last one, which I think we need to be very much aware of, is this microbial resistance that we are seeing with many of perhaps illnesses that are likely to be resistant to much of the antibiotics that we currently have in place. I think we've all heard about, for example, the MRSA. That can affect you. If you were to get infected with that, it becomes very difficult to cure. But what about the regional business climate? Well, what do we have to do? We need to have this economic recovery from the pandemic, but it has been slow. We do need to have a continual gradual recovery as expected amid rising price pressures. We have the impact of the war. What's that likely to mean for us here in the region? One of the issues that we currently have, of course, is that our governments are still running very high fiscal deficit, and the region remains highly susceptible to natural disasters. So coming out of that global list of risks, we do also have these 5 major risks that I think are going to be impacting our regional business climate over the next few years. But how have we performed? As you can see here, 2020 really took a toll on all of our economies in the Caribbean, except of course for Guyana, which grew by over 40% because Guyana began producing oil towards the end of 2020. And it's likely that Guyana will have very, very high growth rates. But as you can see here in 2020, all of the economies fell by about 11%. There was somewhat of a recovery in 2021, where we grew all by about 3.3%. Still really driven a lot by that high growth rate in Guyana. Our debt to GDP ratios, if we look at it between 2019 and 2020, rose significantly. As you can see, they're almost rising by 20 percentage points because of the great support that governments had to give to our economies during that time. And if I look at what's been going on with government debt to GDP ratios, here is where our countries are at the end of 2021, with about, I would say, just under 80% debt to GDP ratios. And that line going across there shows you the average. But of course, many of our countries' debt to GDP ratios are well above that. Unfortunately, with Barbados still being amongst the highest there. Belize, there's also some worrying signs there. But it means that eventually many of our countries are going to have to put in place some austerity measures to bring these numbers down to manageable levels, because there has been research to say that once your debt to GDP ratio exceeds 60%, and then certainly over 80%, the economy tends to start to lag in its growth performance, because it throws off the investment confidence of the private sector, because then private sector firms, private individuals are starting to worry about what the government will have to do to bring this down eventually. And so here I thought I'd also show you the regional, what's called the primary balance. So this really gives me a measure of how well government finances are doing. I strip out interest payments from this to give us a clear idea. And for most of our countries, primary balances are still fairly negative. And this is something that I think we're going to have to deal with. If you want to bring your debt to GDP ratios down significantly, particularly if they're quite high, then countries will have to start running primary surpluses. So you can see what's happening here in most of our countries where primary balances are still negative. Those will have to turn up significantly if we want to bring our debt to GDP ratios down. And so it's always useful, in speaking about economics, we have to say, well, what does all of this mean on the ground? And still, if I look at for countries where I'm able to get data for, poverty rates in the region are still fairly high. One of the things I should be saying here, and as accountants on this, you would be aware, data is really important. As you can see here, some of the data that I've managed to glean is still quite dated. But as you can imagine, in the midst of a pandemic and what has happened, it is quite likely that some of these poverty rates have deteriorated over time. So let me just go now to our risks and challenges. And the next slide, although I've put up some equations in this slide, I don't want you to be too fearful of it. I'll be happy for the organizers to share these slides with you later on. But really, what I'm trying to say here is that when we look at inflation, it is really about a growth rate in the price level. And that usually is determined by the difference between the growth rate of nominal spending, so really around the level of GDP, and of course the growth rate of of real output over time. So what does this all mean? When I do all of these calculations, and don't pay too much attention to this, inflation rarely rises either because one, nominal spending growth is higher, two, real output growth is lower, or three, a combination of the two. And I think what we're seeing here in the global economy, and which something that we need to be aware of, is that both of these are happening at the same time. And so that's why we're seeing this high spike in inflation. What central banks will have to do is to try to really rein in that level of nominal spending. And that's likely to lead to some sort of recessionary fears. And I think later this year, if not early 2023, we're probably going to see the global economy tip a bit into recession, and that's likely to have some knock-on impacts for us here. So inflation is really important for us to keep our minds on, because it's not only about what's happening now, but what will be required to bring inflation back down to manageable levels. And I think in the case of what we're seeing now, we're likely to see a significant breaks on economic activity if we want to bring inflation down. I think, in my mind, a lot of the global inflation that we're seeing started even before the Ukraine war, and it was really down to a lot of money being spent in the economy in terms of being pumped in to support the economies during the COVID pandemic without the required level of economic activity there. So there was always going to be this huge mismatch between too much money chasing too many goods. And of course, in the region, we're all aware that we are in the midst now in the hurricane season. And this just gives you a reminder of what hurricanes can do to us. And from what I've seen, the forecasts are that we're likely to have some severe storms passing through. In fact, even Cuba was already hit with a hurricane this year. But this is just to show you the level of impact that hurricanes can have on our economies, leading to as much as over 400% of GDP loss in Montserrat in 1989. And of course, we all remember the horrible storms, the horrible Hurricane Maria in 2017, and what that did to Dominica. But one thing I want to show you here, and I just go through some of our risks and what we need to be aware of in the world, is what's happening to population growth. As you can see here, 1950, 2.5 billion people. Quite a considerable amount of those people were in North America and Europe. That's about just under 30% were there. If I now go out to 2017, world population increased to 7.6 billion. But as you can see, bulk of that population is now actually in Asia. And of course, you can see what's happening in Africa as well. But of course, the percentage shares in North America and Europe declining to about 15%. But if I project that out to about 2100, you can see what's happening with population growth. I think it's really important for us in the Caribbean to think about these numbers and how are we going to build resilience? Where are our new markets for the future? And I think from what I've been seeing, if we look at what's going to happen in Africa, for example, where they will have about 40% of the population, Asia with 43%, we have to think about how we can tap into those new markets where, for example, in Africa, bulk of the population will likely be very, very young and looking for opportunities. So I think a lot of consumption activity there, and we have to think about how we can tap into that, along with how we tap into the Asian market as well. But we also have some population issues that we need to be looking at home. When we look at this data from the UN, which we're actually forecasting, for many of our countries in the Caribbean, although overall population is likely to increase by 3% to 2100, for many of our economies, there's likely to be a significant decline in population. This is really due to lower birth rates and, of course, an aging population. So the projections here, is, for example, is that Jamaica will decline by 50%, Grenada by 35%, Trinidad and Tobago by 28%. Barbados declining by about 10%. Population decline is something to be worried about, because what we're likely to see here is an over-dependency ratio. So those persons who are working, how are they going to be supporting those who are not working? So those who are under the age of being able to work, and those who are retired. These are things that we need to start thinking about now if we are going to manage and build resilience for the future. So if I just show you here now, what's likely to happen for labor market recovery, and just to highlight two things here. Overall unemployment rate for women are still higher than the total, and that's something that I think we need to be doing about. If we want to bring greater gender equality, we have to ensure that more women are participating in the labor market and certainly earning the right types of wages. And of course, this number one issue that I think we must be aware of, our regional youth unemployment rate is still too high. It's over 20%. And in fact, when I look at some of the data in our Caribbean region, it is over 40%. Now, we all know that the longer someone stays out of the labor market, it's very difficult for them to ever re-enter the labor market. And so if you are staying out of the labor market at a young age, you are unlikely to find employment because you don't have the required experience. But of course, you do still need to eat, and it can lead to social problems or antisocial behavior, as some commentators like to call it, leading, of course, to sometimes criminal activity. So if we want to deal with some of our issues and build resilience, I think we also have to ensure that we are training our young people for work and ensure that the job market is open enough and flexible enough. And I'm going to speak about that as to why I think these are things that we need to do in order for us to build resilience. Okay, so what's the outlook for 2022 and beyond? Well, here is what regional economic growth. We think in 2022, perhaps our economies will grow by just under 10%, driven really a lot by the commodity exporting economies. Guyana, when you see the next slide, is likely to continue growing at a significant rate. And of course, the service economies as well. For the individual economies that I'm able to get all of the data for, here's what it's looking like. And although the regional average is a little bit different to what I presented in the first slide, this is just based on the data that I have for these economies. Guyana is expected to see significant growth in its economy, and that is a very good thing. And I think Guyana, we need to ensure that Guyana maintains that path. All of the other economies are likely to see growth, but certainly not as much as Guyana, leading to an overall growth rate here for the data that I have for these economies of just under 8% in 2022. Looking out further, well, we continue to see, for example, for all of these countries, growth rates continuing out until to 2026, but of course declining over time, because in 2022 and 2023, we're sort of doing catch up with the declines that we saw because of the pandemic. And so over time, we expect these growth rates to diminish somewhat. But the problem here is that we are returning to our normal state of low growth. And remember, we still have high debt. These are some things that we need to look at. And unless we want to turn our economies around and to have greater levels of flexibility and to build resilience, then these are things that we need to pay particular attention to. Once here, so let me just go into the final bit of my presentation, which really speaks to some of the new ideas about building resilience. I'll just go through these quickly. I think this idea that the CARICOM has about producing 25% of our food by 2025 is good. How do we improve our food security? It's amazing that we are not producing this at this point in time. And it's really a tragedy that we have not prioritized this previously. I think we need a situation where all hands are on deck. to ensure that we are food secure. It's ridiculous that we are not producing much more of what we are consuming. And that will require a massive sea change, including education about what it is we should be consuming based on what we can produce here. But luckily for us, technology is improving. And so, for example, I've seen a firm in Tobago called Berry Cove, where they have started to produce strawberries and other types of berries based on the technology of hydroponics, and of course using a situation where they have now an internal climate. Perhaps the technology is right for us to utilize so that we can start producing much more of the things that we like to consume beyond what we can naturally grow here. But in order to do that, we need to have a deepening regional cooperation, implement systems that accommodate cross-border trade, of course, digital solutions, and we need to simplify things. I think that's going to be important. My next slide, if we are going to build resilience, I think it's really important that we look at improving our educational performance. When I look at the mathematics pass rate here for grades 1 to 3, it's still not good enough. And if I was to reduce that to 1 to 2%, mathematics pass rates would be in the 20%. And I think we have to look at how we improve this, whether it's about the curriculum or how we're teaching, but I think major studies are required. And so if I just go into the final bit of my presentation now, what I think we need more of in the Caribbean is economic freedom. And when I look at the Economic Freedom of the World Report 2021, I find that many of our Caribbean countries are not economically free. Now, what do I mean by that? When I'm looking at size of government, legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, overall burden of regulation, and gender legal rights adjustment. When we look at all of these things, we are not performing well, and hence it is actually impacting our ability to grow our economies. Now, what do I mean by this? When you look at the data globally, the most free countries have much higher, and when I say free, I mean economically free, have much higher per capita GDPs, as you can see here. The least free countries, as you can see, low per capita GDPs, and this is in purchasing power parity, that triple P that you are seeing there. And it is not just something due to time. In all of the economies that are free, we see better life expectancy, we see better literacy and numeracy rates as well. And so before I move on from that, I really think that we need a concerted effort to move towards freeing our economies. And I think if I was to say something here, I think we need less government in our lives at this point in time. That is something that we're going to have to be advocating for. Okay, and can we stimulate regional capital markets to finance both public and private initiatives and what we know as public-private partnerships, these 3 Ps? I think that if we are going to build resilience, this has to be the cornerstone of what we look at as well. Can we utilize the significant amount of liquidity that is moving around our banking sector, earning very low returns? Because anyone who has money in a banking account in the region knows that you are losing money, if particularly now in this high levels of inflation that we have. Can we find some ways to channel those resources towards stimulating our economies, not only in public sector infrastructure, but also for private finance? We have enough money here. I think if we were to put things in place, we could stimulate the regional capital markets. And so, and recently, CARICOM has said that they plan to put forward proposals for a regional securities market. I think that this is something that we're going to have to ensure happens, because we need to ensure that the money that we have, the monies of our citizens that are saved within our banks, are being utilized for the development our economies and helping us to build resilience. So with that, I've come to the end of my presentation, and I will now hand it back to you, as moderator.
Thank you very much, Justin. And we specifically want to thank you for offering to share your slides with us, because that was a lot of information to digest in a very short space of time that, totally impacts the Caribbean and us as individuals and the profession. With such a very short space of time left, if you had to prioritize based on the economic recovery roadmap sort of presented, what would be like your top 3 priorities for us on the road to recovery?
Yeah, certainly. I think when I look at what's happening in some of the other smaller territories, albeit they are overseas territories of the UK, they are prioritizing private sector investment. And that means sort of the government pulling back from its role in the economy. I think being part of the private sector now, I have noticed that it is too difficult to do business in the Caribbean, and we need to make that a lot easier. We're at that point in time in our development path whereby we need to unleash the wild spirits of entrepreneurial activity. And so I think it's important that we pare back government intervention in the economy. Secondly, I think we have to find some way to ensure that we are utilizing the finance in our financial system for our own development. And right now we don't have the mechanisms to do that. I think a regional securities market has to be a critical role there. And then finally, I would say have been looking at this, and I've been quite worried about it over the last 2 to 3 years with the pandemic. And even before that, we need to ensure that we are educating our young people for the modern labor market. And that means being able not only to operate in the domestic labor market, but also to produce goods and services that can be competitive on the international market. And so I think at the regional level, we have to look at what CXC, that curriculum, and of course, how we go about doing the teaching. And we can do this with technology now. There's no reason to say why someone in St. Vincent and the Grenadines or in Barbados cannot be receiving, I guess, their education from a very good physics teacher who might be present in Jamaica, or Guyana or Trinidad, So I think those are things that we need to look at. Those would be my three priorities.
Thank you. And we're looking forward to a session later on in the conference where we speak to the next generation of accountants. And, we have CSEC and CAPE happening right now across the region. Those stats that you shared, very, very concerning. And clearly, as the accounting profession, we're all about educating as well. So, awesome points made, a lot for us to digest, and we absolutely look forward to getting those slides from you so that we can take it in further. Justin, we want to thank you very much for the time taken to share with us this morning. It was an absolutely informative session and a great start to our 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you.